Good morning and welcome to the National High School Center's first of 5 webinars on our early warning system implementation process and tool. Today's webinar is on the EWIMS process and team formation. My name is Matt Honstein. I'm joined today by my colleagues Laura Urhat and Susan Bowles-Terrio. Today's presentation has 2 parts. In the first, Susan will lead a brief overview of the EWIMS implementation process, as well as use of the EWS tools. Following that, we'll move to our EWS community of practice for a brief interactive Q&A. And I'm going to turn it over now to Susan, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thank you, Matt. As Matt mentioned, today I plan to provide you with an overview of the 7-step Early Warning Indicator Monitoring System implementation process. It's a mouthful, so we also call it the EWIMS implementation process. As some of you may be aware, the National High School Center has been developing early warning system tools for a number of years, and in the early stages of working with states, districts, and schools, we quickly realized that simply giving educators a free and downloadable tool was not enough. We really needed to provide users with guidance on how to use the tool to support students. So the National High School Center team developed an implementation guide to serve as a companion to the National High School Center early warning system tools, but that can also be used with any other state, district, and school level tools. The development of the EWIMS implementation process evolved over time and combines research as well as experience from working with states, districts, and schools piloting this implementation process. First, the EWIMS implementation process reflects research on effective data use in schools and places it within the context of early warning systems. Then, the National High School Center worked with 2 states, Texas and Virginia, over the course of several years, and through this experience, the states, district, and school level users provided feedback on how to make the 7-step process more accessible and meaningful to educators. And the result is this 7-step EWIMS implementation process you see before you. As you can see, it's a cycle, and today I'm going to briefly describe each of the steps as we move forward. So, in step 1, you need to establish roles and responsibilities. It's important to know what the work entails, what the work of implementing an early warning indicator and monitoring system entails ahead of time in order to be certain that you have the commitment of members and support from leadership. This is a great example, this step, of how we use practitioners' advice to refine the process. Initially, we called this step developing an EWIMS team, but feedback from state, district, and school-level stakeholders suggested that there are already a number of teams, as I'm sure many of you know, that are in operation, and suggested that this work become part of a pre-existing team. One example of that can be found in Virginia, where the state really strongly recommends that this work be part of the school improvement team's efforts. In other instances, this work has been dedicated to an EWIMS team because it's been a challenge or issue, that is raising graduation rates, that the school really wants to focus on. So regardless of how you want to form the team, it's critical to know what the commitment means. So the point is that there are specific people designated to do early warning systems work. The team and its members have to be prepared for a variety of responsibilities, including meeting regularly, using data to make decisions about students, communicating issues related to early warning systems to stakeholders in the school, in the community, and leadership, and then obtaining feedback and information about early warning systems and monitoring student progress throughout. During the discussion on team formation and membership, I'm going to go into greater detail about considerations for this step, so I'm going to hold off for now. So in step 2, it's about using the early warning system tool. EWIMS teams, or whichever team you assign to this work for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to call them EWIMS teams, have to use a tool that supports the work of identifying students who are displaying indicators of risk, which means that they may not graduate. This step should not be underestimated. It is critical that a team member or an individual who supports the team is able to use the tool proficiently in order to provide the team with data and reports to inform their work. So what does this mean? Not everyone needs this skill, but someone does need this skill. Otherwise, the team will be missing the critical information needed to make decisions about which students are at risk. It's also important that we should note that the use of the tool is not a once-a-year event. The data need to be updated regularly. Symptoms of risk can manifest themselves if you're using, for example, the incoming indicator, even before students enter the school, and otherwise as early as the first 20 days of school, and then each grading period thereafter. The tool and the data and reports from the tool undergird the implementation of such a system, and so you really need to maintain this. And then speaking of reports, there are many ways to look at the early warning systems data. The tool should help the team to observe school-level patterns as well as patterns among individual students. And these reports will inform the work of the team. So you can see that the data that are input into the tool are really critical to the output and then the underlying decisions that teams will make. So we're not going to go into this too deeply, but I did want to cover what the indicators are that we're talking about. Excuse me. And if you want, I should also say, and if you want more information or more in-depth information about this or other aspects of it, you should go to the National High School Center website at betterhighschools.org, and you'll get this presentation as well as lots more information on the indicators. But as you can see in the table before you, it really describes each of the indicators we're talking about, the time frame in which they can be observed, and remember, I mentioned that the tool has to be updated throughout the school year, as well as the risk thresholds for both middle grades and high school. These are based on research conducted in places such as Chicago, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, and National High School Center tools use this as the basis for the tool, and the settings of the default risk thresholds. So, briefly, the indicators include an incoming indicator, which is often locally defined and based on information from the student's prior year of schooling. An attendance indicator, which can be calculated as early as the first 20 days of school, and then at each grading period thereafter. A course performance indicator, which refers to student grades and particularly failing courses. A behavior indicator that is locally validated, as there's no consensus in the research about the indicator, but generally when used and validated locally, educators tend to use referrals and suspensions. And then there's an end-of-year indicator, which provides a summative assessment of the student's year and can become the incoming indicator as a student progresses to the next grade. So step 3, the team has to review the data in the tool. The goal is to review early warning systems data in order to accurately identify students who are at risk based on the best predictors possible. You'll want to look at the data to understand patterns in student engagement and academic performance. And student engagement is a broad term that can mean many things to many people, but it really captures this idea of engagement, attendance, and course performance are used as proxies for identifying that engagement. So there are some questions you need to ask yourself in reviewing the early warning system data. Excuse me. First, at the student level, you want to look for patterns. What are your data telling you about individual students who are at risk? And then you take a step back and look at school-level patterns. Do you see data? What are the data saying about how the school is doing? For example, are there students who are flagged from the beginning who are remaining off track throughout the year? Or are there students who were flagged at one reporting period and back on track? You can see the value added perhaps through observing these indicators over the course of the school year. Now, I just want to show you a quick example of what a report may look like. This is from one of the National High School Center's early warning system tools. And as you can see, it allows you to see patterns in the symptoms of risk among students. This is a school-level report, so you can just really see trends. The report can be particularly useful when you're examining a full year of data or just a grading period, and it's a great way to communicate student needs to a broader audience, for example, at a staff meeting, to leadership, or to the community at large. Now, this is an example of a student-level report, and this is something that a team may use to identify individual students who are at risk. And as you can see from this report, excuse me, there's a great deal of information in it, including what the student is flagged for and how many risk symptoms or flags they may have. So this is just an example of what an EWIMS team may start to look at as they're implementing this. Now, step 4, interpret early warning systems data. This is a critical step, and the step, I have to say, that is most frequently skipped during the implementation of EWIMS. Truthfully, skipping this step can actually undermine the improvement strategy as a whole, and you may ask why. Well, why people skip this step. Teams really want early warning system indicators to diagnose student needs, but risk indicators simply do not provide a diagnosis. This step is where professional judgment and systemic approaches to diagnosis come into play. So as I've mentioned with early warning systems and indicators, we have data that shows symptoms of risk, but as we all know, the reasons for a student displaying these symptoms can vary tremendously. Anyone who's worked with the student populations that are at risk know this well. The reasons a student is at risk are often complex, not simply explained by predictive indicators of risk. And so what does a team do? The team has to examine additional data from many sources that are not in the tool. For example, I've worked with teams that talk with parents, students themselves, as well as teachers who have these at-risk students in their class, or they may even examine the students' prior school records to observe challenges in order to gather data on what issues and challenges and the needs are for these students. There are a multitude of data sources out there and available, and the team really has to decide which sources it will use, which sources are accessible, which is pretty critical because some are less accessible than others, and how the team will use these data and information to make determinations about student needs. As you can imagine, the process can be time intensive, and it's time sensitive. Teams get better at it over time. Initially, the team needs to be looking for commonalities and needs among students and raise new questions to understand students' reasons for being off track for graduation. In other words, getting at the root causes. So just to provide a little more information about this critical step, as we know that dropout is not a single point in time, but rather a cumulative process affected by multiple contextual factors, including family, school, peers, and neighborhood. Personal and school factors contribute to either success or failure, as we all are aware. A few statistics from a report from Bridgeland and others show this variation. In a survey of dropouts, nearly half, or 40% of them, said a major reason for dropping out was that classes were not interesting. Nearly 7 in 10, or 69%, said they were not motivated or inspired to work hard. 80% did 1 hour or less of homework each day in high school. 2/3 would have worked harder if more was demanded of them, and 70% were confident they could have graduated if they had tried. So these students really just disengaged. But many students also gave personal reasons for leaving school. 1/3, or 32%, said they had to get a job and make money. 26% said they became a parent. 22% said they had to care for a family member. It's clear that some dropouts, but not the majority, leave school because of significant academic challenges. And that's really the key here. So to get at these root causes, you need more information. Early warning system indicators are capturing student disengagement early, and that's the key. Providing EWIMS teams the ability to understand root causes before these students drop out. And the results of these analyses can lead to changes in how individual students are supported, groups of students are supported, and possibly change policies and strategies that are embedded throughout the school, so school-wide. So step 5 is assign and provide interventions. After identifying students who are at risk with some information and gathering some information about root causes for student risk, it's time to take action. And now this is the critical piece in this process. We do not need another system for flagging students who are at risk. The idea is this gives you a targeted audience to take action with, and that means providing students with supports and interventions. I want to emphasize this idea of supports and interventions. Typically, in the minds of educators and all of us, this tends to mean a student who's identified as at risk is placed in a dropout prevention program. However, in this instance, we're identifying students early, don't forget. So a dropout prevention program may or may not be what they need. For example, if you find that a student has failed math in the second quarter grading period for the first time, the antidote may not be a dropout prevention program. It may be some intensive support in mathematics. Supporting this notion, in the report by Bridgeland and others that surveyed dropouts, 35% said that failing school was a major factor for dropping out. So it wasn't necessarily that they needed a program that addresses engagement issues per se. They were failing school. Indeed, 45%, nearly half, said they started high school poorly prepared by their earlier schooling. Again, it's an academic issue in this instance. So I've described a lot of instances when it could be social, academic, context. There's a lot of things coming together to find these students and why they're at risk. And you can see the way to support them can vary greatly. It's important to realize that the term intervention, as we're using it, is broad and can and should include supports that you wouldn't typically associate with dropout prevention. In order to accomplish this task, team members have to be aware of the supports and interventions available to students. This is a point where team members may take an inventory of the available supports and interventions and their characteristics, and then begin to match students based on the diagnosed needs from step 4, and quickly, 2 things happen, typically that is. First, the teams discover that there are gaps in the availability of supports to meet the needs of students they've diagnosed, and second, they become overwhelmed with the number of supports and interventions and the matching process itself. So in a response to that, we have identified a tiered approach that can be used to match students to interventions based on these individual needs. The tiered approach reflects a more systemic approach that schools and districts are increasingly organizing specific strategies or programs into tiers that are based on the intensity of the interventions. Generally, the model may have 2 or 3 tiers of interventions. Tier 1, typically, interventions typically are applied to all students in the school. Tier 2, interventions are moderately intensive and applied to small groups of students with common needs. And Tier 3 interventions are the most intensive and are provided to individual students with the highest level of need. In a tiered intervention model, the bottom tier includes dropout prevention strategies that are good for all students and are usually implemented at the school level. Excuse me. These usually cost the least for the school, and all students can benefit from them. For example, an advisory program where all students are engaged, but they're grouped into small numbers of students and assigned to an adult in the school who in turn provides mentoring support to the students as they move through school, could be a Tier 1 universal strategy. Areas that are addressed at the universal level are institutional factors such as school climate, rigorous courses, teacher effectiveness, or even extended learning time for the whole school. However, excuse me, for a subset of students, these school-wide universal dropout prevention strategies may not be enough to engage them in school and encourage them to perform well academically or to meet their needs. So these students will be placed into Tier 2, targeted, or Tier 3, individualized interventions. These students will be identified using data from such tools as the Early Warning System tool, and then they can be given targeted support based on their needs. Excuse me. These more targeted and individualized strategies, however, usually cost more money. On to Step 6, monitor students and interventions. In Step 6, after assigning at-risk students to interventions, teams have to figure out how to monitor the students that are placed in the interventions and or supports. The team can use this information to make necessary changes or corrections by identifying students whose needs are not being met or identify students who are no longer struggling and may not need the intervention any longer. It's an ongoing process, and ideally the process allows students to move fluidly into and out of supports as they need them. It's highly unlikely that a team will get the matching of students to interventions perfectly right the first time. That's why this is so important. Between the new steps of diagnosis and starting to understand interventions and supports and exactly what they offer in the school, adjustments will need to be made and definitely should be made. In addition to honing skills of matching students to interventions through this step, these data that are gathered over time by the EWIMS team will allow the school to make decisions about the degree to which interventions and supports that they have currently in place in the school actually fit the needs of the students in the school. Again, this takes time, but it's an important piece. We all know it's challenging for schools to determine whether an intervention is making a difference, and EWS data can actually help this effort. So there's two things with this step. One, you're monitoring the fit of individual students to the supports that are being offered, supports or interventions, and two, you're looking at the interventions themselves and seeing whether they're meeting the needs of students in general. Finally, the team really needs to be communicating with families and appropriate stakeholders to get their involvement in this monitoring process. While you should not be sharing student-level data with these individuals necessarily, depending on who they are, you can engage them in the process of supporting students. Excuse me. The last step of the EWIMS implementation process is to evaluate and refine the process itself. While this process can be refined as it's being implemented, always keeping in mind the balancing of available resources or what is possible with what needs to actually be done. The end of the school year is a really important time to refine the process. As I've mentioned throughout the presentation, the EWIMS team will get better at this work over time, and it takes time to create efficiencies, especially in the use of the tool, diagnosis of student needs, and matching to interventions. So to the degree possible, you want to make sure you're documenting your processes so that you don't lose lessons that you've learned in the past year. Last, the end of the year is an opportunity to identify big picture issues. For example, is there a common student need that is simply not being met by the interventions and supports that are available in the school? Or is there a support that would benefit all students and that should be considered for school-wide implementation? Or is there a new trend and needs for students who are entering into the school that will need to be addressed? I mean, just taking a moment to look at the big picture will improve the work of the EWIMS team and the school and the district. So now, as I promised, I want to talk a little bit about this idea of team formation and what those fundamentals are. And the team really must include individuals who are able to make decisions, have knowledge of students, expertise to manage data, and some examples of these people could be the principal, the school counselor, teachers, middle school representatives, middle school teachers, high school teachers, special education teachers, English language learner teachers. I really could go on and on. But the important point here is it's not simply the guidance counselor's responsibility or the dropout prevention program coordinator's responsibility. It really needs to get the engagement of a cross-section of the whole school. So while I've suggested some potential members, it is actually critical that the individuals who play specific roles. So it's more about what they can bring with them with their levels of authority, for example. So, for example, an individual has to have the power to make decisions about students in the school. And I say that because I've observed situations where the time it took to make a decision about assigning students to supports after several approvals was so long that the student identified in the beginning of the school year was not placed in a support until mid-year. Now, this is an early warning system, and so the aim here is to be nimble and agile in response to student needs. Team members can really influence the ability of the team to be nimble and agile in the school. Next, there needs to be representatives who have knowledge of all students in the school. This means including core subject area teachers and specialists, like I mentioned before, and there's probably others. And then, as I've mentioned several times, the skill to manage and analyze data must be present, as this is the basis for much of the work and how this team will be making decisions. So I've learned that careful selection of EWIMS team members can really make or break the effort. It has the power to generate buy-in, support planning and implementation, and really bring things to scale, especially when a school-wide need is identified. It really creates the opportunity for innovation and improvement when decision makers are at the table or the team members are empowered to make big decisions. So one area where EWIMS teams struggle is the sensitive nature of the data which has identifiable student information. Careful considerations should be made for ways in which members can be included and participate, but that also safeguards student identities and information. While broad and diverse membership is critical, this factor of safeguarding student information can limit membership. So I have learned from observing some practices in this arena. So teams I've worked with have what I described as a layered membership, where they might have a core team focused on looking at student data and diagnosis that meets with some frequency, but on a less frequent basis, they could include a broader audience not sharing identifiable student information that even includes community members and parents. And this is information where they can share school-wide issues and needs. And it facilitates the sharing of information to the broader audience. So now you're engaging many stakeholders, and it empowers others to make changes that may impact the students who you're trying to help. Other teams have operated with information access levels. It's pretty similar to this layered approach that I'm talking about, but it's the idea that certain individuals have different levels of access to the student level of data based on who they represent and what is appropriate, always safeguarding the student information. So similar to like a network administrator with administrator rights, and then a series of different levels of rights for users. One example of this would be a team that loaded all of the data that's in the tool and locked it down so that members could access reports, but they couldn't change data in the tool in any way. Another would only provide summary reports to the team at large. So these kinds of considerations are important to take up front so you know how and when you can engage your team members. Last, I want to just mention that EWIMS team members need to bring a range of skills and expertise. I feel like I've said this many ways. You're going to need leaders. You're going to need technical experts in terms of student needs, use of data, knowledge of supports, and it's likely not one person, and likely shouldn't be. There still may be other skills that are needed, and by looking at the implementation cycle itself up front, teams and leaders can plan for who and when they may need members to engage. So that concludes our brief presentation for today. In a moment, we're going to move into a live chat through the National High School Center's Early Warning System Community of Practice. But before we do that, I just want to make you aware of some upcoming webinars that will be conducted in a similar format to this and that are focused on early warning system. There will be an introduction to the new early warning system collator tools on the October 10th, effectively using your EWS report, hints and tips, which is a great one, on October 25th, assigning students to appropriate interventions on November 8th, and progress monitoring with early warning system tools on November 27th. If you're interested in participating in any of these, you can register today at the website you see here. It's on the National High School Center's website, which again is www.betterhighschools.org. And you can also access archived webinars there. So, and in addition, there are some early warning system resources and information that are available. And as I mentioned before, we'll go into a little bit more depth. There's a community of practice, which you can access at the website.
Sorry, everyone. It sounds like Susan's having some phone issues, so let me just finish up this real quickly. In addition to the resources on our website, you can also follow us through social media at Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, or on our community of practice, which we'll be moving over to in just a minute here. Like I said, the final portion of this today's presentation will be a live chat hosted through our community of practice. You should have received email instructions with the instructions on how to join this webinar, with instructions that will allow you to join the live chat. If you did not, simply go to community.betterhighschools.org, log in or sign up, and the first thing you'll see is a link that says EWS live chat with 2 chat bubbles. Click on that to join our live chat, or use the link in the slide. Thanks everyone for joining us, and we'll hopefully see you on the chat.